This conference will now be recorded.
So one thing I didn't really realize about Sandusky was its industrial history. We were a big paper manufacturer, lots of shipping. We were one of the largest ice harvesting centers in the country. We'll take ice from the Sandusky Bay, one of the largest fish, lots of the fish industry was huge. Obviously those industries are not as big today. The Bay barely even freezes over anymore, unfortunately. Lots of breweries, including this one, the Keebler Brewery, actually eventually became part of the Cleveland Sandusky Brewing Company, which has a lot of remnants in Cleveland, and really big automotive industry. Whereas Cleveland and Lorain were big on steel, with also some automotive. For us, the automotive industry was huge. Everyone knows Sandusky as Cedar Point, and that goes back. Last year was their 150th anniversary, and so people used to take the trains in from Cleveland and Toledo and all over, and would get off at the base of Columbus Avenue in downtown, and then take the boats over to the peninsula. And so Cedar Point has, even though we're a big industrial city, we've always been known as vacation land or a place for people from northern Ohio to come and spend some time. So there's compared to some other amusement parks across the country, the history of Cedar Point is also is really fascinating. There's still a lot of that left in the park today. Sandusky's story, though, is not dissimilar from larger cities like Cleveland or Lorain or Toledo or many other legacy cities in Ohio. I think we don't, at least being from Cleveland, I never really thought about smaller cities in that context before in Ohio. But we suffered from suburbanization, just like Cleveland did. We suffered from suburban sprawl and disinvestment in the city. Our factories shut down, jobs were shipped overseas. The Sandusky Mall was built at the end of the 70s, which, common story, downtown Sandusky became, the shell of what it was. We had all of our department stores down here. Here you can see a picture of, on the bottom right, of what our current City Hall building looked like at the end of the 90s. So kind of, really desolate in a lot of ways. But it's that common story of being a Rust Belt city that just on a smaller scale really happened here. And here you can see our population peaked around 35,000 and then has been a downward climb. Probably the downward climb started about 10 or so years after it did in Cleveland. But again, something that we're probably all familiar with. And so as things progressed in the early 2000s, like other cities, we saw a lot of reinvestment starting to happen on a smaller scale. The building on the left was an old paper factory, part of the Hind and Dowk company, and was abandoned for quite some time. And in the early mid 2000s, it was renovated into a condominium complex, which was one of the big first major investments in a long time downtown, and still a very desirable part of the city to live in. And I think that helped spur a lot of the reinvention of downtown. Some very early entrepreneurs coming into the city, opening restaurants. Again, a similar story that we all know. But unfortunately, as that was kind of picking up, it hits 2008. And the recession hits, and a lot of the growth and potential that was happening obviously took a hit and set things back. But I think a lot of those early forerunners really helped set the stage to what we're seeing now and hope to accomplish in the future. So with that kind of background context, I'll throw it over to Eric to kind of talk about what we've been doing in the last few years.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I grew up in Sandusky and left after high school to go away to college, and then spent a year in Cleveland, and then to law school, and then back to Cleveland, and really somewhere along the way fell in love with cities. I'm not a planner, but I've faked being a planner for a long time. I had the chance to work with really talented planners, many of whom are on this call, as well as Tom. And having grown up here, but then kind of pursuing community revitalization during a stint in the Cleveland Mayor's office, and then as the director of the Development Corporation in Ohio City, the further along I got on that path, the more and more I thought about the great potential that I had always seen in Sandusky as a native of the area, but the real need to see the city become a better partner to the revitalization that Tom was taking place in places, including but not limited to our downtown. And I think that was one of the challenges. And just to put that into perspective, like a lot of communities that viewed themselves primarily as either a manufacturing town or even sort of Sandusky's identity that is known more broadly as a resort town, the city proper itself, and particularly the downtown, were never viewed as a great priority. And so we're kind of allowed to decline without a lot of efforts from a public-private partnership perspective to bring it back. But one couldn't go to downtown Sandusky or see Sandusky's historic neighborhoods and not realize that it was just dripping with potential. But to put that in perspective, shortly before I came back as city manager, the city did a survey of its top priorities. And I think the revitalization of downtown Sandusky was listed as the 35th priority on the list of the needs of the city by a city commission that I think was kind of afraid of its own shadow in some ways, because they thought that sort of the populist mindset in the city of working exclusively on delivering services, et cetera, wouldn't allow them to get away with taking a more bold step. But I was very fortunate in that in 2013, a group of sort of enlightened leaders within the community felt as if the city had hit rock bottom and ran for city commission and won. And they wanted to be more bold about revitalizing the city and focusing less on what used to be and more on maybe what was possible today in the current environment. And so I came back in summer of 2014, and almost immediately we began to work with the business community, predominantly Cedar Point, to pass a joint income and admissions tax, which the city had rejected income tax increases, which were very unpopular here, in part because I think people looked to Cedar Point as a revenue generator, and we only had a 1%, which is the most you can pass without a vote. In fact, the city, I don't believe, had ever voted to raise taxes on its own incomes or for the municipal government purposes for that level. So we said, okay, let's do an income tax increase, a modest one, but let's get Cedar Point to agree to a raising of the admissions tax as well. But then let's dedicate those resources to as much of them as possible, not just to stabilizing our services, but to sort of creating a new culture, a new identity of sort of partnerships between the public and the private sector, and really re-envisioning what we sort of call the destination economy. And so that passed with about 60% of the vote, which was important symbolically because the previous three efforts to pass the income tax increase had failed with about 60% of the vote against it. And so we felt like we had some real momentum. And with that began about a year-long planning process as we approached our 2018 Bicentennial that we call the Bicentennial Vision Plan. And as part of the Bicentennial Vision Plan, what we did was engaged over 2,000 residents. We worked with city architecture. I think there's some representatives from there on this call. We hit every Sandusky neighborhood. We had focus groups. We had a steering committee. We had real leadership. And with that, it was an exciting time to do that plan because we were approaching our bicentennial in just 3 years, and we were going to use that as a deadline. And that was something during my time in Ohio City that we were able to find some success with the West Side Market Centennial as a lever to sort of catalyze some public and private partnerships and collaborations to invest around the market and in that neighborhood. We kind of replicated that model here on a citywide basis with the Bicentennial, but it was exciting not only because of that deadline that was looming, but in addition to that, because we had those resources from the passage of the Issue 8 campaign that allowed us to start to directly fund things in what became the recommendations of the plan. And we really started with the neighborhoods, because remember where sort of the waterfront and downtown Sandusky kind of ranked on that list, and we knew that there was a gap in the services that we've been providing, and we knew we had to demonstrate early and real wins for the residents of Sandusky who had felt left behind by some of the success that had happened at Cedar Point, or the sprawl out in the neighboring communities where the mall and other big box was located. And so we did a few things. We dedicated, for the first time in a decade, a lot of capital resources towards neighborhood parks. In about a 5-year period, we redid 8 neighborhood parks in Sandusky. We hadn't done any parks in about a previous decade before that. We also dedicated about $400,000 a year to revitalizing our housing stock directly from our general fund, which is uncommon in the state. And we created down payment assistance programs. We created renovation programs, and we passed a 10-year 75% residential tax abatement, along with some increased code compliance as a way to help protect investments that were being made in the neighborhood. and that became very popular. And then we looked at things like trees and sidewalks and community policing, and we beefed up our neighborhood recreation, our recreation department from 1 staff to 3 staff, and created some innovative programming on the ground, all of which were meant to boost community spirits and to stabilize Sandusky's neighborhoods. In addition to that, and Tom's going to talk to this slide a little bit, we saw with a predominantly service-based economy, as we had transitioned out of heavy manufacturing, that we had most of the lower income residents in that region that we anchor that were living in Sandusky, but were having a difficult time getting the service jobs that existed. And so transit became a very important tool for us. And transit has, unlike Cleveland, where there's a regional transit authority, the city is actually responsible for running transit on a countywide basis. So with that, I'll turn over to Tom on transit investments.
Yeah, Sandusky is actually a rural transit agency, so categorized differently than Cleveland RTA. But I think even in the time I've been here in 30 years, it's been fascinating to see even just how the perception of the community has really changed around public transit. And our previous administrators have done a lot of work with reorganizing the routes. The main route that runs down Milan Road, which is where Kalahari and Great Wolf Lodge are, it's sort of our main business trip. It doubled the frequency. The ridership was really going through the roof almost every year, increasing over 100% over the previous year, until the pandemic hit, of course, which really set things back, unfortunately, but is now recovering. And so, we're about to actually embark this year on a strategic planning process looking at public transit for the county and for the city, and how that works. Because I think we started primarily as a city-run dial-a-ride service with a couple of vans, and we've now expanded to 6 fixed route lines and dozens of a lot of demand response across the entire county. And not sure our management and leadership structure and funding sources have really kept pace with that. And so we're hoping to take a look at that and how can we better serve and better organize our transit system. But it is, interestingly, I got rid of my car when I was living in Washington, D.C., and then moved home to Cleveland, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and never replaced one. And then when I came out to Sandusky to move out here, I thought, all right, well, now I finally am going to have to buy a car. And so I just kind of tested it and to see how it would go without one. And I'm still almost 3 years and still haven't needed one. And I think a lot of that comes back to being able to use Sandusky Transit to get to shopping or get to the mall or whatever I need to do. So that was another thing that surprised me, was really having that ability to do that, in a small city like Sandusky. But when you look at the numbers, I think 13% of our households don't have access to a vehicle. 40-some% have only 1 vehicle per household. And so, again, not something that's always top of mind when it comes to smaller cities, but transit and transportation is just as important in these small places, as they are in bigger cities too. And so, I think that's something that, the city definitely wants to continue to invest in and make better. But definitely a huge part of, I think, what, of the success has the city seen in the last few years.
And so with investments specifically into neighborhoods, with really beefing up the transit system, we thought that we had the credibility and the desire, and we knew it was a necessity. And one thing I'd say is, turning a corner culturally in legacy cities can be really difficult, because there isn't always the will among the existing populace to make transitional investments. As most of working in planning, no one seems to be satisfied with the status quo, but also people are very afraid of change. And one thing that in finding success in Sandusky, which is not unlike the success that I've been fortunate to be a part of in places like Cleveland, I think there's a few really critical things that have to happen. I think one is that you have to have a very highly collaborative process. You can't do this in isolation, whether you're the city or nonprofit or an institutional anchor of a neighborhood or a private entity or an entrepreneur. You have to genuinely be willing to collaborate. You have to, once you identify those collaborations and the strategies, you have to identify resources. And you do that in different ways depending on whether the local government, obviously issue aid provided that opportunity for us. And then you have to surround yourself with a very talented and dynamic staff and empower them to get things done. And so really that's what we set about doing after the passage of issue 8 in Sandusky with the new resources,
is we built partnerships to identify how we were going to deploy them that weren't just what the city was going to do, but what our partnerships could do. And I'll get into some of that. And we started to build out a team. And I say that because it was probably not popular for us to build up our Department of Development and Planning, but the Department of Development and Planning that I inherited at City Hall was 1.5 people that was overseeing about a $700,000 a year CDBG grant process, as well as in a responsive way, taking in all of our Planning Commission and Board of Zoning Appeals approvals, but there was really not much else going on at all. And so over the period of a few years, we built that department from 1.5 to 10 people. And the other thing to mention as a backdrop in Sandusky is there is no development corporation here. We have a county-wide entity, Erie County Economic Development, that functions more like a Team Neo type entity, but there was no real place-based partner doing revitalization like the type of work that many of you do with community development corporations or other entities. And so we had to kind of create that in-house. And then the pandemic hit and we atrophied from 10 to a smaller staff for a variety of reasons. There's some attrition and some that we had to make some difficult decisions as to layoffs. And now we're in the process post-pandemic of rebuilding the staff, but we're also in the process of looking at how we create deeper partnerships so that we do have nonprofit partners that can be more nimble to assist with some of that stuff. And that's part of our current plans. But with all of that being said, we took 1/2 of the increase in admissions tax through the passage of issue 8, and we dedicated that specifically to economic development activities, which again, I think is rare in the state of Ohio, that you have cities putting general fund dollars directly into redevelopment. And so we created a pot for substantial redevelopment of large projects where we can play a gap financing role. And in early years, what we were trying to do, because we had a relatively weak market and a lot of older and vacant and abandoned buildings, particularly in the downtown area, is we were trying to add our 10% equity infusion into projects of $500,000 or more to the state and federal historic tax credits that are available, just to simply make projects, pro forma out or be financeable to provide the equity needed to attract the private lending. And then in addition to that, we did, and a lot of this I learned in Cleveland through their storefront and signage program, which we were able to use a lot of when I was at Ohio City in particular, as those of you who worked in other neighborhoods have used as well. And so we know one of the hangups always with our storefront facade renovation program were a lot of those CDBG requirements. So we used general fund dollars for the economic development program, which created a much simpler program. And it was a way for us, even as we worked on larger redevelopments, to tap into some of those smaller businesses and property owners. And then we had small business grants for businesses that were either existing and expanding or moving new, which became a nice tool. And then we started to tell a different story about Sandusky, because I think like so many, and unlike Destination Cleveland, which I think does an incredible job to market Cleveland and to provide a stronger brand for that region, our Convention and Visitors Bureau destination marketing partner is a broader 2-county for Erie and Ottawa County, Lake Erie Shores and Islands. So they're not putting resources directly into marketing or creating a brand for the revitalization of Sandusky. So we did set aside a modest portion of our economic development funds so we could begin to tell Sandusky's story. And that was part of that cultural shift, both internally and externally, that we're trying to lead in the city. Because I think too often legacy cities are defined by those who left, by the challenges in the city. Everybody hears the stories that get put on the street by realtors and brokers and suburban counterparts as to, challenges in schools, challenges in safety, race used as a weapon to divide as opposed to celebrating diversity and bringing it together. So we decided to find the city by its strengths, which were its diversity, which were the historic assets along the waterfront, the neighborhoods, the walkability. But if we didn't tell that story, there wasn't anyone else that was going to tell that story on our behalf. So we began to invest modestly in that through a lot of videos and other things that really went viral and took off. And we've kind of built on that from there. And so some of the projects, for example, these are all vacant buildings that were redeveloped. The first is the Schmidt building. And that's a project that was vacant. Now it's 8 residential units above 3 storefronts. On the right, you see City Hall, and that was a very difficult project. We moved our offices back into City Hall from a 1950s style building that sat about 3/4 of a mile from downtown, and it was important to us to come back into the heart of the city. So we took the 3 largest vacant buildings that you can see in that picture on the right, and we partnered with Maroos Development, and we were able to get, we're a tenant in that building for the first 7 years while the tax credits are in place, and we will become the owner of our portion of the space. But That was actually modeled in some ways on Cuyahoga County's renovation of its own offices or new construction of its offices in partnership to get the Ameritrust building and the building where Heinen's currently is. So in 2 of the buildings, you have 18 apartments. In the 3rd building, you have our commercial offices, and then you also have 3 commercial storefronts. And that has state historic tax credits. It has some of our own economic development funding. It has federal historic tax credits and has new market credits. And it took all of those resources to get these buildings back online, but it was a major important first investment in showing the private market just how committed the city was to supporting their investments in these difficult buildings as well. And another thing that came out of the Bicentennial Vision Plan was that we have a lot of, particularly on the edge of downtown, underutilized surface parking lots. And it was controversial, but we wanted to put those back into productive use. So this was a city-owned parking lot that played a host once a week to our farmers market. We moved the farmers market to where the new city hall is located along our historic Washington Park. And then we partnered with Bowling Green State University and Cedar Fair, the parent company of Cedar Point, to build a new school of resort and attraction management, which just completed its 1st year in that program. And part of the reason it was important for us to bring a college downtown was, one, the seasonality of the tourism economy would help to be balanced out. There'll be 200 students. There's 80 apartments here and then a 20,000 square foot classroom facility. 200 students a year will participate in that program. They'll be here often when the tourists aren't. And in addition to that, from a workforce perspective, our 4-county region, which includes about 220,000 people, is one of the only 4-county regions in the entire state where you have 4 contiguous counties without a 4-year institution of higher education. We do have a branch campus of Bowling Green, but so we're trying to find creative ways to expand higher education opportunities as a tool for talent development and attraction. And then addition to that, these are projects that we've supported. When you see the future holography building, that was a 4-story building that sits right at the center of sort of Columbus Avenue and Market Street, which is State and Main for downtown Sandusky. A individual who grew up in this area, went away, made a fortune in biotech, sold his company, and has come back to be sort of an angel investor, had purchased the historic Cook building there with an intent to renovate it, found with approval from our Landmarks Commission that it was not salvageable. And so it would have left a giant hole in our downtown. But we've been working with Jobs Ohio through its Vibrant Communities program. It looks like a significant grant will be made to this building from that. And then through our own economic development funds and tax increment financing, this building is actually under construction now. Those of you who come Saturday will see it's all framed up, all 3 stories. And so we were able to, instead of that being what would have typically been in Sandusky, a hole in the center of downtown for 2 decades, we were able to go from the demolition of the historic structure to groundbreaking on a new construction building within, I think, 14 months. And so we're really proud of that. And then to the right is another project we're partnering on with Maru's Development, which is the largest historic vacant building in downtown Sandusky of 8 stories. Maru's is in the process now of renovating that into 44 market rate apartments above commercial storefronts. And again, I think we have 1.3 million and what's about a $14 million deal from the city's economic development fund, without which that project would not have been possible. And both of those actually have tax increment financing on them, which will allow us to take the funds to work towards streetscape and other elements of infrastructure improvements downtown. And we've used TIFs very strategically in Sandusky. We have a great partnership with Sandusky City Schools because we have admissions tax revenue from Cedar Point. We get one of the smallest shares of the local property tax in the entire state. I think our share of the property tax rolls is about 6%. And so because of that, the schools have been a very good partner to work with us on tax increment financing of larger projects, because they appreciate us not having levies that compete with their funds for property taxes, which are how they primarily fund the Sandusky City Schools. Many of you probably remember Dr. Sanders, who was a former CEO of Cleveland Schools. He's also a Sandusky native, and he came back about 8 years ago to become the CEO of the district. So with those TIFs in place, we were able to put a TIF on the Cedar Point Sports Center, which is just on the very eastern edge of the city. It's an old abandoned airport. The Erie County Airport and the Ottawa County Airport merged about 20 years ago, and that land had sat vacant for a while. And then it was purchased through a partnership between Erie County and Cedar Point to build a brand new indoor-outdoor sports complex. We're using tax increment financing on that complex to build the Sandusky Bay Pathway and Landing Park, which the Sandusky Bay Pathway is an 11-mile from the eastern edge of the city to the western edge of the city bike trail. where we have a mile zero in the downtown, which you see in the upper left corner. So we built that first mile and revitalized our waterfront. And then there'll be a beautiful park on the sports center, which sits on the back bay of Sandusky Bay. And so you're seeing elements of that pathway. Our goal, and we're working with the environmental design group based out of Cleveland, is that eventually the Sandusky Bay pathway is a 70-mile trail that will connect up with Work, Lorain and Cuyahoga County, as well as to the west towards Toledo, to become part of a Lake Erie trail. And we've been working actually lately very closely with Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur's office, who that is a vision of hers as well, as to see that Lake Erie trail can link all of our counties along the lakefront in Ohio. And then one of the most high profile projects and probably the most controversial one that any of us have had to deal with here was we took a 330 space parking lot right in the center of our downtown, immediately to the east of the Chesapeake Loft project, which Tom had talked about earlier, which had tax increment financing on it from when that building was constructed. And through our comprehensive planning with city architecture, and then ultimately a conceptual plan for both Shoreline Drive and the Jackson Street Pier, decided to turn that space into a park. And at one point we were going to eliminate all or most of the parking there, but we heard from locals that there was a major backlash to removing the waterfront parking, which a lot of them on a year-round basis have gotten used to reading a newspaper, drinking a coffee, and watching either the sunrise or set, which you have great views of both from this site. So we did a compromise that allowed us to take about 80% of the parking back. We widened the boardwalk to 40 feet on the northern edge, so you could still create a public space while living to fight another day as to some of that parking. And that pier reopened last year and has been incredibly transformational for the entire downtown. Along with Shoreline Drive, you're seeing investment up and down that street. It is designed to accommodate programming. We have a year-round pavilion space. We raised about $900,000 from our Bicentennial Commission and other local stakeholders as part of the Bicentennial celebration for a stage, an LED movie screen, and an ice skating rink. So we have a fund to program that on a year-to-year basis. We actually dedicate 10% of the city's lodging tax collection for programming. The pier reopened last summer and was incredibly busy the entire year without any programming due to COVID. We will launch our programming now in July, I believe, with 10 free concerts to the public, which should be really exciting. And that schedule will be coming out soon, as well as family movie nights on Tuesdays. The pier also gets activated on Saturdays through fitness programs, and our rec programs have moved a lot of their stuff into the pavilion facility. So you're seeing that become active, and it's a wide range of ages. It's a diverse group of our citizens. It has really become the focal point, which we really needed along the waterfront and for the city.
Yeah, and it's, I'll echo what Eric said, and I think it's really been a transformational place. And I think one thing that I was sort of struck by when I first came to Sandusky, coming from Cleveland, is how really accessible the waterfront feels. You get to cross train tracks or railroad tracks to get there, and just being right out on the water, I think is pretty unique feeling. And looking at the pier, I think was sort of a great example of a planning political project, though, too. I'm sure if I didn't work here and I was just visiting Sandusky, I'm sure I'd take a picture of the parking lot at the end and tweet about what idiots the planners were for putting parking on the most valuable spot of the pier. It goes to show you, sometimes to get projects done, you have to make those compromises, and that was obviously one of them. But I still think that it functions in a good way, and was really transformational, despite some compromises that had to be made in terms of design. But I think city architecture and people that were here performing did a great job in really bringing that to life.
Absolutely.
Shoreline Drive, and I don't think you would have had the success that the Jackson Street Pier has had if you didn't do an accompanying investment along Shoreline Drive. And like a lot of different cities, our shoreline was industrial at first, and Tom showed you some pictures of that with the rail, and it was mostly warehousing. And so the buildings that actually front Shoreline, their entrances were mostly along Water Street. And we had a wide street because the rails had been removed. And so when we were doing the planning for the downtown and the pier, we looked at how we could take that space back for patios, how we could make Shoreline Drive more the front door of the city. And we really wanted to get that first mile of the Sandusky Bay pathway right. So we did a multi-use path on the north side of the street. We dramatically narrowed the traffic lanes, which people complained about. But the amount of foot traffic that you're seeing out there and bike traffic, it's incredible. And then we left very wide sidewalks on the south side of the street by going from most of the street to parallel parking. That has allowed for very large patios, which brings life to what was the back of those buildings before through rear patios. And the amount of investment you're seeing
I think nearly every building on Shoreline Drive has either recently been done, is about to be done, or is in the planning stages to be redone. And I know there was a mention of 100 million invested. That's specific to the downtown, and we're seeing that number start to exponentially go up. We've seen over 300 million invested on a citywide basis, which I can assure you is probably the most that you've seen, particularly outside of Cedar Point, in decades in the community. And projects like this that people are like, why are you doing this? And my guess is probably 60% of the public was legitimately opposed to going forward with either Shoreline Drive or the Pier. We fought through that. We weren't afraid to take the risk of going forward. We held the city commission together. We had many, many public meetings and tried to craft those compromises that allowed the project to go forward. And now that it's finished, 95% of the public loves it. And you're seeing so many different people use it on a day-to-day basis. And it's really changing the culture of, our work in the first several years has changed the culture within City Hall. I think our work in the last several years has allowed us to change the culture of the community by virtue of creating dynamic public spaces like Shoreline Drive and the Jackson Street Pier.
And we're always a few years behind trends here in Sandusky. So we finally just got scooters that are now buzzing up and down Shoreline Drive, which is actually pretty cool to see. It really activates the, makes it feel much more dynamic and a lot more fun. And so that's been a fun thing this past summer to have joined the downtown scene.
Absolutely. So what's next? We have several things on the horizon, but what's really important for us is that we don't, now that we've had some success, that we don't pause there, but we look at how we can continue to layer on that. And so one thing that we did was we did a downtown master plan last year with MKSK out of Columbus, and Aaron Blair, who was the project manager of that from MKSK, we actually lured her to Sandusky, and she started this week as our new chief planner to help implement that plan. But it looks at taking Main Street, which is where our Columbus Avenue, which is our main street. It's where the Sandusky State Theater, which was toppled last year by a windstorm but is being rebuilt, is on. It's where the new City Hall is on. It's where that Hography building that was being renovated. We're going to take that 3-block area, which is the gateway into the downtown, and really make it a much more dynamic street that will help pull things together. You can see some conceptual renderings of that there. We're also taking another surface parking lot downtown, and we're looking to add an anchor hotel and conference center to that with structured parking that allows us to stack the parking as opposed to having it be dedicated to surface. And we're going to be looking for partners for that. And we also want to create, as mentioned, a destination Sandusky type organization that works on programming, branding, and marketing, not only of the downtown but citywide, with a predominant focus on bringing that programming to life so that the city can focus on providing day-to-day services and infrastructure. In addition to that, we'll begin this year a South Side master plan, which takes the neighborhood where most of the Sandusky City Schools is. It's been a historically disinvested in neighborhood over the last several decades. And we're looking at community recreation, housing, walkability, because you have the hospital that's in that neighborhood. You have 90% of the Sandusky City Schools population that's in that neighborhood, and the former GM factory, which is in the process of potentially being brought to life with a new tenant. But with all of those assets in that neighborhood, it is very disconnected. It is not very walkable, and you've seen a continued decline. And so what we're going to do is partner with those institutions and look at the types of investments that we need to make to provide a better quality of life for the residents of that neighborhood and to attract more affordable family investment. It's also important to us that along the Hayes Avenue corridor, which connects the South Side neighborhood to downtown, we're not just looking at connections within the neighborhood, but from the neighborhood to the waterfront, so that in a city is the size of Sandusky, which is the size of a large Cleveland neighborhood, we really don't want to see divisions between people who live in the city and the waterfront of the downtown in their neighborhood. We're working very hard, and there's a variety of projects that we're undertaking to foster stronger connections between the neighborhood and the downtown, because for so long over the last 30 or 40 decades, we've lost those connections. They become frayed as most of the commerce in the area took place along the 250 corridor. So in addition to the South Side plan and implementing the downtown plan, we have on the horizon for next year, we're calling a mobility plan, which we're actually in the process of finalizing right before the pandemic and had to delay for a year. We want to get that back on track this year. So we're going to continue to plan, and hopefully it allows us to think bigger about what's possible. And I think with the culture that we put in place and some of the resources that we put in place, that our future is bright. So with that, I think we're happy to answer any questions, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Eric and Tom, thank you guys both very, very much. As Tom has put up there before we get into the Q&A, or actually, let me say quickly again, for those of you who have any questions, I know we have 2 in the chat right now. Please feel free to submit them in the chat. If you want to ask your questions live, maybe the best way we can do it, you can put your video on and kind of wave at me. I'll try to pay attention here with everyone on there, and I can ask you to unmute and ask your question. But while you're thinking of your questions, again, just a reminder that this Saturday we have the part 2 of this event, the walking tour, to check out all of these great developments in person, as Tom and Eric mentioned. 1:30 on this Saturday. The meeting spot will be City Hall, Sandusky City Hall. Be roughly, I think, Tom, like a 2-hour tour, maybe a little bit longer. Not a 3-hour tour, because those are always bad, right? 3-hour tours are always bad. You get lost at 3-hour tours. Make a day of it. Head up there in advance. Hang out afterwards. A lot of great spots up there to check out. So really quick, this question is to Eric from Debbie Berry. What do you think is the largest factor contributing towards the 60% passage of issue 8 when it had failed in the past? And it sounds like the past leadership, though there would be no chance of passing an income tax increase. Was it Cedar Point support, new leadership, education marketing? So what do you attribute to that passage?
I think it was genuinely all of those things. Cedar Fair at that time had a CEO who was relatively new in his position. I was a new city manager representing a newly elected city commission. So I do think it was a combination of fresh faces in positions of importance. And most of all, I think that in the city and Cedar Point working together, as opposed to being on opposite sides of this issue, which had happened historically, we were able to rally the support and run a much more sophisticated campaign. I think we raised about $150,000 from the campaign, predominantly through the business community in Sandusky, which I think somebody said that the most expensive campaign in Erie County's history before that was like 30 or 40,000. So we ran a sophisticated campaign with resources, and we delivered a message of unity as opposed to division. And historically, it's always been Cedar Point versus the community. This was sort of Cedar Point and the community, and I think it made all the difference. And I think honestly, it was just a matter of it had been really bad politically at Sandusky. I think when I started as city manager in 2014, I was the 7th city manager in a 14-year period. I think people were just tired of churning out new managers because things weren't going the way people wanted, so they would just fire somebody or push them out and bring somebody new in. I think people realized we'd hit rock bottom on some level, at least from a political perspective, and that provided us with the opportunity to say, this is your chance to decide as a community what type of community you want to be, which was a common refrain of that campaign, and ultimately people responded really well. And then just 2 years later, they passed another bond issue to build 3 new elementary schools in the city, and the schools heavily used the imagery and symbolism of the issue 8 campaign to pass that bond issue. So some of that is carried through. Now that we're 7 years into this plus, I will say, the fatigue is sort of set in. We're trying to find ways to continually reinvent, but never waste a crisis. I think the pandemic and Sandusky was one of the hardest hit cities in the state, if not the country, because of our reliance on tax revenue from tourism, particularly to Cedar Point. We had a really tough year last year. We were down about 30% in our general fund, and the stimulus money has really kind of stabilized us from the federal government that's coming our way. We're receiving about 18 million. So I think we're going to try to turn that crisis of the pandemic into an opportunity to think big yet again, and hopefully make, breathe some fresh air into people's excitement about what's possible.
Thanks, Eric. This next one's probably a good follow-up question. You mentioned Cedar Point. Christine asked a question in the chat that she would be interested to hear both yours and Tom's take on the recent increase in wages for Cedar Point summer employees. I think she mentioned I think it's up to $20 an hour, 100% increase from 2020. The question is, are you already seeing this effect on other businesses, in Sandusky?
Well, I can say really briefly, but Tom, jump in, because I know Tom and I had a meeting with our transit partner on their own need to raise wages, not driven necessarily by Cedar Point's increase in wages, but certainly response to that. And I think if you were to talk to the public, particularly small business owners, there was some initial concern that drastic of a wage increase that fast on a community that is so dependent on an influx of seasonal workforce. It made some people nervous, and we're seeing some of that impact. But I think it's also part of a broader conversation that's important for us to be a part of.
in which wages really do need to go up in this area. I do have a heavily service-based economy, and we need to make sure that more often than not, those service positions can create a living wage for people. We believe it's kind of the point where Cedar Point, and we know they're looking at this, is actually looking at creating to decrease the transient nature of positions and maybe allow them to extend their season, more full-time positions. And we want to make sure those are living wage jobs as well. But I am cautiously optimistic that the wage environment needed that bump. And I think that over time, you're seeing people respond to that. You're seeing wages go up. But I do think in the short term, it was a real shock to the system that had people scrambling a little bit. Tom, I don't know if you're going to speak specifically to transit or anything else on that.
Yeah, no, I think, obviously that's something that's been feeling across with all sectors. And, we've been really struggling with finding enough bus drivers in town, as everyone else has. And so, we've been looking at, what we can do with our contract with our third party provider to, raise their wages to make it more competitive. And, so I think a lot of that's still to be seen how that everything kind of shakes out longer term. But like Eric said, us being sort of a tourism based economy has always been kind of, I think we've always kind of struggled with that a little bit here. But so I think a lot of it is still TBD, but hopefully we'll, rectify some of our short term issues.
Next question that came up from Joe Duffy from the city of Euclid. How much active manufacturing exists in or adjacent to downtown today? Either Tom or Eric.
We
So,
have,
no, go.
I was gonna say, we have not a lot there. Directly to the west of downtown, there's a company called Metal Tech that operates, really just like in the one block to the west and sort of along the lakefront, which is probably the less developed part of our waterfront. There used to be industry on both sides. Some of those, we had one industrial building that was torn down. There's another one that sits between downtown and Battery Park that's still operational, but it's definitely not near what it used to be, and it provides us a lot of potential redevelopment sites, especially between downtown and the Battery Park on the eastern edge, which was addressed in our downtown master plan. So I think that allows us a lot more flexibility too for growth within the core of the city moving forward. So sorry, go ahead, Eric.
That was great.
A follow-up question related to the Shoreline Drive and Jackson Street Pier. So you mentioned there was 60% of the public was against Shoreline Drive or Pier at the beginning. Did you ever have the threat of lawsuits to stop the project, or projects, I should say?
Yes, we sat down with attorneys and they tried to do a referendum at one point to get it on the ballot. But the way that we designed the legislation, it looked like it was sort of referendum proof on some level because it was a public improvement. But that all being said, it was also during the backdrop of a municipal election, and we never intended it. We always thought the City Hall project would be more controversial than the Pier project because moving City Hall traditionally not the most popular thing. But once the Jackson Street Pier project was announced, that became the focal point or the lightning rod, and the City Hall project was actually able to go through relatively smoothly. But because Jackson Street Pier took so much longer to get through the planning phase than we had expected, we went from thinking we have municipal elections every 2 years that elect city commissioners. We ended up right in that summer before the campaign. It became the issue of the campaign. So we had 3 incumbents that were up that year. And there were opposition that were running specifically against the Pier against them. And they were very nervous. And we had to work really hard to craft compromises to keep the city commission at the table to actually vote. Both the planning commission and the city commission was nervous about that politics. And we got them there, but they were nervous. And we were all kind of nervous going to the election. But what was great is that as much attention as that project captured, all 3 of those incumbents were reelected, and then again they got to live 2 years later, see the project actually get built, and I'm not kind of basked in the sense of having been proven right, I guess, would be without sounding too pro the Pier. But I think that everybody loves it now, and we're hoping, although we can't take it for granted, that when we begin planning on Columbus Avenue, which we know will also be controversial because people have a lot of conceptions about what Columbus Avenue means to them, similar to the Pier,
there was a famous sort of buzzing the Ave where people used to drive up and down that street on Friday nights, and they want to make sure, they have a lot of sentimentality around vehicles on that street. We're trying to turn it more into a pedestrian-oriented street with some vehicles. And so we're hoping that we can say to them, look, you trusted us on the pier. You're happy with the progress and the outcomes. Let's continue that trusting relationship with Columbus, but we'll see how it goes, this summer.
I think those are important stories or background information, Eric and Tom, because I think a lot of the times, we always see, the initial concept and then the finished product. And sometimes we forget about all the muck and hard work that goes on in between those two, from conception all the way to implementation. So I think those stories are always important to remind ourselves that it just doesn't magically happen, right? You close your eyes and then it just appears. That there's a lot of work and a lot of hours put in to get from point A to point B even.
And actually, Arthur, if I just could really briefly,
Sure.
City staff on that, but also city architecture and Alex Pesta and his team did an incredible job navigating that process and respecting the opinions and the feedback that we heard along the way, but staying committed to a strong design. And it's really hard to understate how involved the community was in this project. And I want to ask Tom to speak to the weekend before the pier opened. Staff took a tour. There was a soft opening of the pier of that weekend before it had officially opened. And Tom had the great idea, because he's a social media wizard, of doing a Facebook Live, like walking tour of the pier. And how many people, Tom, watched that video? And it was literally just on the spot, like, we should do a quick Facebook Live of this. And I think, I want to say it was around 30,000 viewers that night, which for Sandusky, we're a city of 25,000 people. So you put in perspective, like, nearly everybody in town was watching that video apparently, and people from the outside of it. And but that just shows you how much interest there was in seeing that project get done.
No, that's great. This next question, is from Adam Davenport, who I'm going to invite to unmute and ask it, because I had a very similar question. So I'll kind of state my question, and then Adam, if you want to ask yours, because it's in a similar vein. I was interested to know what your plans were, or what you have been doing, and maybe future plans of incorporating, water transit into the mobility around town, obviously being on the lakefront. And Adam, if you want to unmute and ask your question, you had a similar question as it relates to visitors and tourism. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the last time I was there, Eric and Tom, we were talking about kind of like some of the government structure around the islands, and I can't remember what is in what county or not, but it's different and confusing for me. So I was wondering if there's like what the relationship you have with the islands and the government there, or whatever the situation is, and then kind of how they see Sandusky as benefiting or deterring from their traffic, et cetera. And then, if there are any plans on the table for drawing people or keeping people in Sandusky, vice versa.
I'm sure Eric could probably go on for hours about this particular question. We talk about it a lot, and I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some sort of tension within our larger region about our Convention and Visitors Bureau. Eric talked about how it differs from Destination Cleveland, and obviously it's very not focused on Sandusky necessarily here, but on the islands. And I think if you look at we have one ferry, the Jet Express, is like alternate route that runs to the islands from downtown Sandusky, but all the other ferries are in Ottawa County. And if you look at the places where those are, I think Port Clinton is a great little town, but it's unfortunately kind of like scarred by these huge parking lots that are used for ferry traffic. And I don't know if anyone's been to Mackinac City, to get to Mackinac Island, like you go there and it's basically like a big parking lot with some stores to get onto the ferry. And so I think we want to utilize the islands as a pull, but also like not let our downtown just be as like the stopping point to get on a boat to get to the islands, but also be a destination in and of itself, which I think benefits us as a community more. And I think the most startling thing I saw was last year when there were no ferries operating in town because of the pandemic. How many people were out and about downtown utilizing the waterfront here, Shoreline Drive. I think it really shows you, if you build a great place and have things to do down here, you don't need boats to go to the islands to actually be vibrant, which I don't think a lot of people really ever thought could happen here. And so I think that was really good to see. But that being said, historically, like I showed the picture of the boats going back and forth between the Slip and Cedar Point, and over the history, there's been a lot of water transportation, which we don't really have. The Jet Express now does make a stop at Cedar Point on its way to its island, on the islands, but it's not very frequent. And so it's one thing, looking forward is something that I know we really want to kind of take a look at and work with Cedar Point, and how can we bring those water transportation connections back so you can get from downtown to Cedar Point, so you can make your experience of coming to Sandusky really multi-layered and going, staying downtown, going to the amusement park, going to the islands, whatever it may be, but really not looking at us as just sort of like a gateway to the islands, but also like as a destination where you have the option to go to the islands, the option to go to Cedar Point, whatever that may be.
And Tom nailed that. The only thing that I would add to that was a perfect answer, is that with our plan to add an anchor hotel to the downtown, the water taxi system becomes even more important to get back and forth to some of those assets. And so it really is a critical piece of that. We have cost out some of what that would take and how frequent and what type of boat. And we really hope to bring that online around the same time as the hotel. There was one more thing I was going to say related to something Tom said, but I forgot it. So I'll leave it at that. But I think he did a really good job comprehensively answering that question.
Another question we have from Andrew from the city of Wobser is commenting on obviously the exciting projects and planning that's happening right now. But as it relates to city corporate limits, it appears that they have stopped at Perkins Avenue. So the question is, was there any push in the past to annex south to control the sprawl, on 250? Or is there possibly a JED or other arrangements?
So the answer to that question, and Tom being the historian may better know the years, but there was a push, and it's interesting, at one point, I want to say in the 50s or 60s, the city of Sandusky voted not to annex Perkins Township because they were choking on the cost of expanding the infrastructure. And then within 5 years, I believe it was the GM plant that was built just south of Perkins Avenue, and there was another vote that was held. And at that time, it was Sandusky that voted to annex and Perkins that voted not to annex into the city. And just all kinds of urban legends or stories that you hear about the history of Cleveland, where if this wouldn't have happened, maybe the city would be different, whether it's John D. Rockefeller leaving town or whatever. The failed annexation of Perkins in the 60s is often brought up here as what could have been had that taken place. That being said, we can't look backwards, we can only look forwards, but I do think, and Tom and I and others in our planning development department have taken a look at other smaller cities that oftentimes we think have fewer assets, but don't have maybe some of the decline issues that we have faced. And oftentimes it's because they're sort of 250 or their Perkins Township in the city are one community as opposed to two communities. And I really do think that's held us back. It's held us back in maintaining, middle class members in the school district and a variety of other areas. But that being said, it's probably not something that's going to change in the future. So what we have chosen on doing, it gets to the question of the JED, is really two things. One is we're trying to position Sandusky not as the one who would need to the Perkins to be strong, but instead to be strong. So by investing in our assets that are unique from the township to the suburbs of the community, and changing kind of the narrative. And we think over time, as people move back to the area, like myself, I grew up in Perkins Township, but when I moved back, I now live, right on the edge of downtown Sandusky. And many of my peers who also grew up in the township are the ones starting businesses here and moving in, and then their parents are moving back into town. So you're seeing those lines kind of break down generationally, which I think is a really good thing. But we are partnering, and KBI, or the new departure of the former GM plant, which sits right on Perkins Avenue, that sits vacant today. We're in the process of doing a special type of annexation to bring that facility back into the city with the support of Perkins Township's trustees, as well as the Perkins School District. They're going to continue to provide services there. What's important to them, I think, psychologically, but the mechanism for that was, as a municipality, we can do a Section 41 TIF, which allows the tax increment financing, the increment from a redevelopment of that site, to go back into the gap financing for the project. And so we think that 41 tool, which is allowed for municipalities but not for townships, is a way that we can start to build up tax partnerships and or annexation. We're also looking at something closely at the Cedar Point Sports Center site, because Cedar Point is about 50 meters to the east of that site. And we'll need probably tax increment financing for future phases of that. So we're kind of on the edges now, looking at opportunities, and we hope to be able to do more of that. Two sites that do not border on the city. One is our NASA site, which is predominantly in Perkins Township, but not exclusively. And then the other is the Sandusky Mall site, which is being redeveloped. We've had talks about JEDs for that site, which are preliminary, but I think all of those are on the table, and we're trying to build a stronger relationship between the city and the township so that they don't view themselves as competitors. And I'd be lying if I didn't say there weren't moments where that relationship breaks down with us in the township or us in the county, but I do think it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back as a whole, as opposed to 1 step forward, 2 steps back. We just got to make sure that we're committed to representing Sandusky, which has really been hurt by the sprawl into the rest of the county while also not building a wall between us and the rest of the county and inviting them in and being a part of our current success.
Another question coming in here, Eric and Tom, from Joe again. So not using CDBG for the storefront program seems like a game changer in terms of user-friendly outcomes. Was there any initial pushback against that proposal?
No, I think honestly, one of the reasons for that was we worked with Cedar Point to say we'll support the tax increase if the city commits some of the funds towards economic development. And so it was really that sense of it was part of that deal. And we've probably mentioned that 100 times since to remind people of it. I think there's modest amounts of controversy using tax dollars, and especially in a town that lacks sophistication on some level, like a smaller city can do. But over time, we try to remind people that they like the success that they're seeing. They like that we've had over 50 new businesses open in the city. They like seeing vacant buildings get renovated. They like seeing vacant, blighted industrial properties be raised where we can start over. And we remind them that that progress wouldn't be possible if we weren't uniquely using these tax dollars for those types of activities. And so, we're probably always one election away from there being a more challenging environment, and people do try to raise those issues, both transactionally and during campaign seasons. But overall, I think people would generally tell you the city's moving in the right direction, and they have an understanding, at least generally, that issue 8 and the types of things that is funding are a big part of why that was possible.
Another question, Eric and Tom, from Chris Garland. Hey, Chris. Mentioning a great presentation that you both did and really being impressed with all the work. Yes, you had mentioned challenges from vacancy. So many Ohio communities have been able to utilize land banks to repurpose properties. Has that been your experience? And if so, can you describe the role or roles of land banking in Sandusky?
Yes. So there's mixed here, and Tom, if you want to jump in on any of this, please do. But we actually, and many of you probably know Matt Lasko, who used to work in the Detroit Shoreway Community Development Organization, and then he came here to become our director of development. He actually left last year to become the city manager of neighboring Huron. But Matt had a really great housing background, and Erie County's land bank, while it was passed, had never really staffed up. And so we entered into a contract when Matt started to actually administer Erie County's land bank from the city. And we were able to partner with the county with some of our own housing resources to raise, and we did with Jim Rokakis and his team at the Thriving Communities Institute, a complete survey, which actually showed that the need for demolition here was less than a lot of other similarly situated places, but we did have about 150 or 200 houses that needed demolition, but more importantly, a few thousand houses that needed some type of an intervention or would backslide towards a place of demolition. And so we were able to take some of our issue 8 housing resources, which were income tax funded, the county land bank, the grants that they were receiving. And I want to say we got close to 200 houses raised, as well as some really big commercial blighted industrial properties in the city that for decades had been issues. The one thing that's a challenge that continues, and now the county has a new treasurer who's kind of moved in a different direction as to what he wants to do with the land bank. We're no longer administering it, but we don't have any DTAC funding, which is the delinquent taxes that the state allows for counties to set aside a portion of the late collections on that to fund land banks up to 5%. The treasurer, we've heard, is supportive of creating the DTAC because now that some of the AG settlement money and the federal money that's flowing to land banks has slowed down. And so we're very anxious to see the county go through that process with the new treasurer. And he will probably administer the land bank in-house is what we're being told. But historically, 80% of the activity has been in the city, so we'll continue to benefit from that. But we've been aggressive on housing rehabs, and we've been aggressive on using the land bank as a tool where possible. But we are behind the rest of the state in that we don't have a dedicated local funding source. And that's part of our challenge, to be perfectly honest here, is our Erie County government functions much more as a rural government and is not funding at all things like economic development or housing, or really providing staffing at a level that would be a good partner to us in that way. And we keep trying to push them to be a part of that, and hopefully we'll get there with them, but it's a strained relationship at times, and one that we really look forward to strengthening, because I think if you look at that stool of like public partnership, city partnership, and county partnership, the county in many ways is missing from that in Erie County.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to kind of do a last call for questions, as I don't see any more kind of popping in. So while we're waiting for anyone else to submit any last questions for Eric and Tom, just a reminder again, second part of this event on Saturday, in-person tour of the city of Sandusky, specifically downtown Sandusky. Meeting location is Sandusky City Hall, the new Sandusky City Hall at 1:30. Information is on the APA Ohio website, ohioplanning.org/Cleveland. The details are up there. Still time to join. We are asking folks to RSVP just to give Tom and Eric some numbers of how many people are going to be there. But feel free to bring your significant others, your family members along with it. Really make a day of it over there. This has been something that my fellow executive committee members, Debbie Berry, who's on the call, and Adam Davenport, we've been wanting to do this type of event for quite some time. Had it in the works last year, and then obviously COVID hit and it kind of changed our plans. I had one more question related to COVID, and it's been a question I think we've been asking generally, and I think it'd be interesting to hear both of your perspectives. But what is something that you've learned from this COVID-19 pandemic that you think you're going to kind of take forward with you? I mean, it could be anything. It could be either related to economic development, related to public engagement. Just what did you observe during that time that'd be like, yep, I'm going to take that and we're going to keep working on that, or we're going to use that, moving forward as we are finally coming out of the dark and stepping into the light here.
Tom, did you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of different things. For me, I think it really made, we really struggled with public engagement last year, because normally we do everything in person, and it was sort of difficult to figure out how do we do this moving forward. I think one thing that was interesting was getting more comfortable with doing digital outreach, or these types of calls, even though I think we all probably have a little Zoom fatigue right now. It really made us think a little bit more creatively about how we can reach people, and we started streaming all our commission meetings on YouTube, which we never did before. And I think those things will actually continue going forward. So in some ways, I did think it kind of forced us to do some things out of necessity that I think are probably good government practices, moving forward, that maybe we weren't comfortable with too. And also too, our budget took a big hit on Cedar Point being down. I think we never really anticipated anything happening with Cedar Point in that revenue stream. So how can we make sure to have be diversified in our funding and our revenue and things like that. And kind of did show some vulnerabilities on our entire system and how it worked. But I think it was some good lessons and some things to take forward with us. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts, Eric.
I would just say, building on what you said about Cedar Point and what a shock that was to the system economically, I think that what buttressed us from that was like our natural resources, whether it was the green space in the waterfront, or the use of the waterfront, or our park itself, is our public spaces continue to remain strong and dynamic, and were more used better than ever. And so I think to us, it really demonstrated the need to continue to pivot from being a mass tourism market to a destination cultural year-round tourism market, which I think has an opportunity to support more small businesses, and to have maybe not 75,000 people in one day at one park, but to spread that out through the week, through the year, throughout the city. And that will probably benefit not only us from an economic perspective, but the lives of our residents too. So I think we want to continue to build on what we saw working during the pandemic, or what people turned to when some of their traditional avenues were shut down. And then just really one quick pitch. Sandusky is so much more impressive in person than you could ever imagine, from what myself or Tom would say in a presentation like this. So I do hope as many of you as possible make it. We're supposed to get great weather Saturday. It's also in the midst of our Pride Festival, so you get to see that going. I think it's our fourth. We missed last year, so it would have been the fourth annual Pride Festival. But Jim Obergefell, who's a Sandusky native and was the named plaintiff in the case that brought marriage equality, we like to jokingly refer to ourselves as the birthplace of marriage equality. He has moved back to Sandusky and is going to be given the key to the city shortly after your presentation by our city commission president. So we're very excited about that. And I think the fact that Jim was willing to move home is an indication of just how far Sandusky's come over the last few decades. And we'd really love to share it with you this weekend.
No, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Tom. Thank you both for the presentation and for your time today. I want to thank Debbie Berry and Adam Davenport from our executive committee for all the work they've done to help put this together. I want to thank Christine Dorsey-Davis, our APA Ohio director, for all the behind the scenes work here with the virtual format. I know, as Tom mentioned, a lot of us are getting fatigued with these type of events. We appreciate everybody joining. It's a lot of work, despite it being virtually, to put it on. So I really appreciate everyone's efforts and everyone's time with respect to this. Again, as Eric just mentioned and Tom mentioned, part 2 on Saturday, in-person tour, kicking off at 1:30, meet up at Sandusky City Hall. Tell your friends, tell your family, bring your friends, bring your family, tell your coworkers, force your coworkers to come out, spend a day out there. It is fantastic. There's all of the work that they've been doing out there is really great. And as Eric and Tom mentioned, it's even more impressive to see it in person, and the weather is going to be great. Lastly, just some APA Ohio or APA Cleveland news again. Be on the lookout. We're going to be announcing our We Plan Cleveland, We Plan CLE series beginning in July next week. So there'll be some great events happening with that. And with that, again, thank you all. Christine had recorded this, and I think we'll be putting it up on the website as soon as we can. So if you know someone who missed it and would be interested to listening to the recording, let them know. We'll put out a posting on our social media on Facebook and Twitter to let you know once that's up there. And we hope to see everyone on Saturday. So Tom, Eric, thank you both again, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
See you this weekend.